So good afternoon, everyone. So the agenda for today is we're going to talk about preparation for year-end, calendar year-end, fiscal year-end, some year-end resources, and then as Danica mentioned, we're going to open it up for a Q&A session at the end. If you have questions and you want to put them in the chat log, you can go ahead and do that as we go, but at the end we'll open this up for questions in case some of your questions may get answered as I go through this. Preparing for year-end in Sage 100. Year-end is always a good time to think about your disaster recovery plan. You want to make sure that you have scheduled verifiable backups that are being stored off-premise, and the most important thing about your disaster recovery plan is make sure that you can restore from a backup. We have had a few Sage 100 customers being hit by ransomware in their IT departments. Fortunately, we're fantastic and we're able to get them back up and running in about a day, having to restore everything on the server. So just make sure that you check with your IT folks and make sure that you have a disaster recovery plan in place. The other thing I like to mention at year-end is the paperless office module. So most of you probably are already familiar with it. The paperless office module allows you to send reports and forms to a PDF format, and it indexes it and saves that information so you can easily access it by module. The reason I like to bring this up at year-end is because at year-end you're typically running a whole bunch of reports, and some of those are great audit reports, especially like vendor payment history that is going to be a backup for your 1099s, that you may want to save that as a PDF file and have it indexed. The nice thing about paperless office, as well as saving paper, if you have an auditor come in, you can sit them down, give them access to the paperless office module, and they will have reports, period end reports, journals, registers from every module to go through and validate what's been done in your system. So it's an audit trail of everything if you're using it. The other cool thing about paperless office is you can also use it to email invoices to your customers, or in accounts payable, you could email vendor ACH payment statements or vendor purchase orders. Creating a copy of your live company. So a backup is great because it saves you if something happens, a fire or a virus or something, but you can't easily access that data. By making a backup or a copy online of your Sage company, you can just switch companies and easily go into a copy of your live company. So a copy is essential if you're using the payroll module because once you run payroll calendar year end, you cannot get that information back. And it's highly recommended if you're going to be purging history at the year end so that if you purge it out of your live company, you could just go into your backup company and see all that information. Calendar year end versus fiscal year end. The calendar year end is relevant for payroll and for vendor 1099s. Okay, calendar year end versus fiscal year end. On Tuesday, they had a payroll webinar. So if you use the payroll module and you'd like information about the payroll year end process, that session was also recorded and will be available on YouTube. So if you would like information on that, just let us know and we can get you the payroll year end. As far as the calendar year end, this session is going to talk about the 1099s portion of the calendar year end. We're not going to really cover payroll since that was covered on Tuesday. Since many companies, your fiscal year end coincides with your calendar year end, I'm also going to go through a fiscal year end close. So we're going to talk about 1099s and then we're going to talk about closing out your fiscal year. All right, preparing for your calendar year end. In order to process the year end tax forms, which would be the 1099s and the W-2s, you must install a 2017 IRD and the year-end e-filing Atrix update. The IRD is typically available the third week of December, and that comes from Sage, and that update is going to have tax form changes in it. If you don't receive that by the end of next week, you can let us know and we can contact Sage and find out if that's been released yet, but it's due to be released maybe December 20th, 21st, somewhere around there. Before installing the IRD, you need to make sure that your Sage 100 and any third-party applications are compatible. And I have here on the screen a list of the compatible releases. So something to note is that 2014 or older is no longer a supported release by Sage. So if you're on 2014 or older, you would either need to update to a compatible release or you won't be able to produce your 1099s through Sage. You'll just have to do them offline. So obviously you can still use Sage 100. You just won't be able to do the 1099s because you won't be able to get the update for the tax forms. If you are in version 2015, the support will be ending at the end of this year, 12/31/2017. So this is the last year you'll be able to get that IRD update. So if you're on 2015, you've got a whole year to think about updating before you get to next year, because at next year end, 2015 will not be supported. If you need any assistance, either updating your system or installing the IRD, you can contact RKL support. If you are on one of the supported versions, note that there's also an update number that must be applied. So for example, if you're on version 2016, you need to be on update 3. If you're on version 2017, you need to be on update 1. If you're not sure what version of Sage you're on, if you go to Help and then About Sage 100, it will give you the year. So for example, it will say version 2017, and it will also give you a version number. So in the screenshot that I have up, it has version 2017, and then it says 5.40.1. The 540 represents that it's a 2017, and the number that comes after that, the .1, that's the service pack that's been installed. So I'm on version 2017, service pack 1. So again, you want to check what version you're on and make sure that you're on one of the supported versions to get the IRD, because that's something you can get done now. You don't have to wait till that third week of December. Go ahead and get your service packs updated so that you're on a compatible release, and that way when the IRD comes out, you'll be ready to go. And if you need help with that, again, you can contact the RKL support group. Okay. So if some of you, I'm guessing, have already done 1099s before, they are processed through a third-party product called Atrix. And you want to make sure that you test Atrix before it's time to actually do your 1099s. And there's 3 reasons I want to have you test it up front, and don't wait until the end of January to go in and look at 1099s for the first time. The first reason is because when you go and you launch the Atrix option, which is going to be an accounts payable reports, you may get an error message saying that it's not installed on your workstation. So in order to access the 1099 e-filing and reporting, there is a workstation setup that must be done on each workstation of each user that is going to be processing the 1099s. So if you don't have access to it, we'll need to get you going with a workstation setup and get that installed for you. Once you're able to access the menu option, it's going to ask you to download required updates for the new year. I have had people in the past had issues downloading the updates because the firewall on the server blocks you from going out to that website. So again, another reason to do this early is if you have any problems installing those updates, you may need to get your IT group involved to open up the firewall to get those updates applied to your system. And the third reason for go ahead and testing this ahead of time is to do a preliminary validation of what's going to be produced on your 1099s, making sure that you have vendor tax IDs filled in, you have vendor addresses if you're mailing the 1099s, and maybe a preliminary check on the dollar amount and that your vendors are properly set up for the 1099s. So again, you guys can do that today after we get off this call if you want. Just make sure you have access. Make sure you can install the updates and do a preliminary check to make sure your 1099 vendors all have tax IDs and addresses filled in. Once you install the updates and launch the e-filing, it's actually going to bring you through a wizard. And the first screen that comes up, and I've got a screenshot here, it's going to ask you for the form type. The 1099s that are supported are for income, dividend, or miscellaneous forms. If you're using miscellaneous, it does not default to miscellaneous, so you want to make sure you fill that in. Otherwise, you'll go through the 1099 process and it will say there's no data because it probably defaults to dividend. So make sure you change that form type to miscellaneous. And you also want to fill in your minimum year-to-date payment amount. So for example, $600. After you fill out this information, it's going to bring you to the next screenshot that I have here. That is, do you want to go ahead and run the 1099s right now, or you can actually do a test drive. So there's an option to do a test drive for your first 25 recipients, or you can do a test drive of all of your recipients. If you do a test drive, none of that information is saved. And the third option in here is to not do a test drive and go ahead and start initiating your 1099s. So again, you can do a test drive and you're not messing with anything. So I highly encourage you to go in and run through that. Again, make sure you have access, and then also so you can kind of look at the data. When you start going through the wizard, it's going to bring up all of your 1099 vendors, and it's going to walk you through the validation process. So in the upper left-hand corner of the screen, you can see it says verify all income boxes. So it's going to come up and say validate your tax IDs, validate your income boxes, validate the addresses of your vendors. And as you go through each validation, you'll hit next, and it will just walk you through validating all of your information. And again, you guys can do this now. You don't have to wait until 1099 time. So you want to go ahead and spot check for errors. The other thing that you want to do as preparation for your 1099s is determine if you're going to be doing e-filing or if you're going to print the 1099s yourself. So Atrix will go ahead and do the e-filing for you. There is a fee for that. It's $1.99 per recipient with a $25 minimum, but I highly recommend you maybe just have them e-file for you. It's so much easier, and then you don't have to deal with forms and all that sort of thing. If you decide that you do want to print the 1099s yourself, you'll want to make sure that you purchase those forms in advance. Sage does offer 1099 forms directly from them. You can go to Sage Checks and Forms, and it will ask you what software you're on, what version of Sage you're on, or you can call them directly. The Atrix system supports 4 1099s on a page. It does not support 2 per page. So if you are going to print them yourself, make sure you get those forms ordered. And again, even if you decide to go to your local office vendor, you may want to go to the Sage website just to confirm what the forms need to look like. Okay, so if you go and do your test run today or tomorrow, by the time you're ready to go in and do your 1099s, it should be a piece of cake. So what you want to do is after you have done your last AP check run for 2017, you want to run the payment history report. The payment history report is going to show you everything you've paid to your vendors. You have an option of printing that report for only your 1099 vendors, or you could print it wide open for all of your vendors in case you inadvertently forgot to mark someone as needing a 1099. You want to save that report, hopefully as a PDF using Paperless Office, so that you have an audit trail, because that is your kind of proof of what you've paid your vendors. You want to validate that information to what you saw in the test drive of the 1099s. And if you find any missing information, tax IDs, or even if the dollar amount is incorrect, you can go into your vendor maintenance and you can fix that information right now in December or even in January of 2018, even though you maybe didn't mark someone for a 1099. So you would go to the vendor master, go to the additional tab, and in the lower right-hand corner, and I have it circled on the screen, is the 1099 information, where you can fill in their tax ID, what type of company they are, what type of form, what their default box is, and then you'll notice there's a 1099 history button. When you hit that button, it's going to bring up the screen on the right where it lists all of the boxes of the 1099s. And for example, my vendor here is set up for non-employee compensation, box number 7. I can go in and just edit the dollar amount. So let's say I just realized that I had somebody that was supposed to get a 1099 and I didn't mark them. I can just go in, turn them on, say yes, they need a 1099, and in 2017 I paid them $1,200, and this is the amount that will print out on your 1099 form. So I think that's super cool, and it beats having to void out checks and reissue checks or anything like that to make sure that your information shows on your 1099s. So you can just edit your vendor and you're good to go. And then you can continue doing that test drive, making sure that all of your information is correct before you actually do your 1099s. When you go through the Atrix 1099 wizard, it's going to take you through, have you validate all your information, and then at the end, it's going to tell you what it would cost if you want to do e-filing. So in my example here, I have 3 recipients that need a 1099. It's $1.99 per recipient, which would come out to be about $6. However, there is a minimum of $24.95. So even though I have only 3 recipients, it would cost me $25 basically to have them e-file for me. But then I don't have to go and deal with buying a whole stack of forms just to produce these 3 1099s, and they're going to do all the filing for me for state and federal. If you don't want to have them e-file for you, the second little screenshot is I can toggle and say I want other options, and I'm going to print the 1099s myself, or you can do a combination of having them e-file your federal and state, but maybe you're going to print out your 1099 combinations. So you would select the combinations that work for you, and then it will give you a total cost. So you can go ahead and print your 1099s and your 1096s without any cost from Atrix, and you can print them. The only cost would be you have to pay for the forms yourself, obviously. So you do still have the ability to produce 1099s free of charge from Atrix, or have them do the e-filing. I will give you a warning that if you choose to do it yourself, it will pop up with an extra screen after this where it tries to market to you, and it will come up and say, oh, you sure you don't want to e-file? You can just bypass that message and you'll still be able to print the forms yourself. But just to let you know that I know the first time going through, I was like, I could have sworn I selected that I want to print them myself, and yet it's coming up with the e-file splash screen. So just read the screens as you go through that wizard. So that is basically it for the 1099s. And again, if you need any help, you can reach out to our support department and we can assist you further if you need it. But go in and do that wizard up front so that you're not scurrying around at 1099 time trying to get access and that sort of thing. So now I'm going to switch gears and talk about the fiscal year end. So your fiscal year close is not much different than your period end close. There are just a few extra steps when you do a year-end close. For example, setting up your next fiscal year and validating what history is going to be purged. To set up your next fiscal year, you're going to go to the General Ledger module, set up Fiscal Year Maintenance, and you're just going to type in the year. So in my screenshot here, you'll see that I typed in fiscal year 2018. I'm going to hit Tab, and then it's going to automatically fill out all of my periods based on my prior period that was set up. And then you hit OK, and that's it. And now your 2018 year is set up, and you can start posting into 2018. The other thing you want to do is take a look at some of your settings. So in General Ledger, there's 2 settings that are affected by year end. One is the Journal and Register Reset, which is the middle screenshot, that if your journals or registers are set to reset at year end, what that means is that after you do your year end processing, your next journal entry number will be number 1. And then at the end of every year, it resets back to 1. There's a third option on that reset, which is you may have yours set to never reset. If it's never reset, then the year end will not have any impact on it, and your journal numbers will just continually increment by 1, and they won't ever get reset back to 1 unless you come in here and decide to reset them. The other setting to be aware of is if you're using budgets, in the General Ledger options on the Budget tab, there's a checkbox that says Copy Actual to Default Budget at Year End. If you're using this feature, you want to be really careful if you end up running your year end more than once. So what this checkbox does is when I close out 2017, it will take all my 2017 actual numbers and copy them into my budget for 2018. So let's say I do my year end in January, I copy my budgets, and then January, February, March, I'm editing those budgets because they're probably not going to be exactly the same as my actuals for the prior year. So I go in and I'm tweaking my budgets and I'm making changes. And then come April, my accounting firm gives me some adjusting entries for 2017. I put those adjusting entries in, and then I run the year-end function again to close the year again. When I run that year-end that second time, it will actually replace any budget changes I've made, and it's going to recopy my actuals from 2017 into my budget for 2018. So again, if you're using this feature, just be careful that if you run the year end more than once and you've actually edited your budget in between, you'll want to uncheck this box so that you don't overwrite all of the budget changes that you've just done. Okay, history. All of the modules have a history retention period. So I've got some screenshots here of the accounts payable module. And there's places where you're going to say years to retain your vendor history, years to retain your 1099 payment history. You're going to have these same settings in general ledger and accounts receivable and purchase orders and sales orders and inventory. So when you run the year-end function, it's going to look and see how many years of history that you're retaining. And if you are retaining more than what it's set for, it's going to purge that last year of history. So you want to be aware of what your history settings are and know that at year end, it may be purging a year of history. And if it's going to do that, you may want to make a copy of your company or back it up to a drive or back it up somewhere so that you have access to that information before it is purged out of the system. The other thing that you'll see in the options of each module is which period is your current period. So in this example, I'm in accounts payable. My current fiscal year is 2017 and my current period is 12. When I run the year-end process in accounts payable, it will go ahead and advance that period for me so that it will be 2018 period 1. And why that's important is when you go to run reports or you do inquiries, you've probably noticed that it defaults to your current period. And I know there's a few of you on the phone that probably haven't done a period end in a while. So you may go in to run a report and it's defaulting to 2016. And you have to remember to constantly change that year and change the period. Otherwise, your default setting on that report is going to be last year's data. So when you're running reports or doing inquiries, this is where it's pulling what your current period and year is. And again, that defaults into inquiries and reports. So it's helpful if you have those set to the current period. Okay, so you want to check your parameter options before you start processing period end or year end. And then you want to make sure that you do your reconciliation. So this reconciliation is the same one that should be done every month. And so if you're reconciling every month, come year end, this should be easy peasy. So the first thing you want to do when you go to reconcile is make sure that all of your journals and registers are posted all the way through. And don't forget the general ledger. So the daily transaction report in your general ledger is probably the most important one, because if you go to try to reconcile and the transactions have not posted all the way through GL, you will most likely be out of balance probably in all of your modules. So make sure that all your journals and registers are posted all the way through. You want to reconcile your modules to the general ledger, and here's kind of a little cheat sheet of what reports you should run in each module, and then you want to tie them to the GL account that pertains to that module. So for example, the purchase order module, there's a purchase order clearing report that can be found in the period end folder in the PO module. And that report is going to show you all your purchase orders that you have received the goods, but you have not yet received the invoice. That report should tie to your purchases clearing account in the general ledger. And it's important that you do this at every month because that purchases clearing report cannot be run with an as of date. So when you run it, it's showing me all my purchase orders as of today that have been received, not yet invoiced. So if I ran it today, it would be as of December 7th. I don't have a way of doing a cutoff saying run the report as of November 30th. The reason your purchase order module is sometimes out of balance is if you get an invoice in and someone's not aware that it pertains to a purchase order and you process that invoice directly through the accounts payable module, then that PO is sitting out there waiting to be invoiced against, and it will stay open forever and it will never close out. And it's going to keep showing up on this report because if that invoice is processed directly through the AP module. It also means that your GL posting will probably be incorrect because if it was an inventory item, when you did the receiving, it would have hit inventory and purchases clearing, and then when you process the invoice, it's going to hit your AP trade and whatever account you posted that invoice against. And so if it was an expense, you might be putting something into your expense account twice. So it's very important that you reconcile that purchases clearing report. The inventory module. If your valuation is LIFO, FIFO, lot, or serialized, then you want to make sure at every month end that you reconcile your negative tiers. And what a negative tier is when you sell something or remove something out of inventory before somebody has received the item into inventory. So Sage does allow your inventory to go negative. So you may sell something and the purchase order receiving person just hasn't gotten around to putting that receipt in yet. And so what happens is it creates a negative tier because when you sold it, it doesn't know what cost to use. So in the period end processing, in the inventory module, there is a negative tier adjustment. The system will automatically try to match up any positive receipts with any negative distributions of your inventory and try to reconcile that information. If it doesn't find any positive tiers, then you would have to go in and manually adjust your inventory as required. Also in inventory, a lot of people do a physical count at year end. I'm not going to cover doing a physical inventory count at this point in time, but if you need any help with that, please reach out to us. The most important thing about doing an inventory physical count is make sure you carefully review your variance register and make sure that the variance it's going to post seems appropriate based on the physical count that you just did. I've had people accidentally freeze all of their inventory but then only count certain inventory items, maybe from one product line or one warehouse, and then they go and post it without reviewing the variance report, and all those inventory items that didn't get counted but got frozen all get reset to 0 quantity on hand, and they have this huge inventory adjustment, and they've just wiped out all their inventory. So if you are going to do a physical inventory account, please, please, please review that variance register very carefully before you update it and make sure that it looks okay and it has the adjustments on there that you're expecting. And again, if you need help with an inventory physical count, we're happy to help you with that. Accounts receivable and accounts payable modules. Typically at month end, you're going to run a accounts receivable aged invoice report and a trial balance report. It is very important to understand the difference between these two reports because it can be a little bit confusing. They don't always match, and the reason they don't match is the trial balance uses the posting date, so the trial balance should always match your general ledger. The aging report uses the invoice date, and so the reason it's good to run both of these reports is if they don't tie to each other, it might be okay because it might be that the invoice date was not in the same period as the posting date, but it could also alert you to somebody may have typed a date in incorrectly. So especially as you're going into the new year, someone might type in January 2017 by mistake instead of January 2018, and that might make these reports not tie to each other. So it's important to understand what the difference is between the trial balance report and the aging report. You want to check with your accountant if there's other reconciliations in addition to these. So this is kind of my minimum, at least do this every month end. The other module for those of you that have manufacturing, either the work order module, job ops, or the manufacturing module in Sage, you want to tie out your work in process to your WIP GL account. Okay, so you want to go ahead and reconcile all your modules. Then the next thing I have here is a checklist of the order that you should close the modules. And again, this should be done every single month end. On this grid, the second column where it says PE is indicating whether or not there's an actual period end function that needs to be performed in that module. So some modules don't actually have a period end function. For example, the first three on this list, bill of material, work order, and manufacturing, there's no actual period end routine, but what you do want to do is make sure that you've posted all journals and registers in those modules before you start reconciling your other modules, because if you have an unposted production entry, that affects your inventory. So if you find that after the fact, now you've got to go re-reconcile your inventory and your general ledger again because now your numbers are going to change. So bill of material, work order, manufacturing, make sure that everything's posted, reconcile your WIP, and run any reports that you might need. The purchase order module, sales order module, again, you're going to do a reconciliation of your PO module and then run any reports that you might have. In all of the modules, you want to make sure that you've checked the history so that you know when you run period end or year end what history might be getting purged out of the system. Some of the modules, like accounts receivable, may have some additional steps that get done at period end. In accounts receivable, you might be computing finance charges, you may be computing commissions for your salespeople, you may be printing customer statements. So there may be a few additional period end routines that happen in that module. The general ledger module is always the last module to be closed because all the other modules post into the general ledger. So again, you're going to close all your other modules first, and you're going to do the general ledger last. The bank module, which I have listed on here, does not really have a month-end routine. However, if you're using the bank module, you're going to make sure you do a bank reconciliation at the time that you get your bank statement. An important thing to note about the bank module is it does not currently retain history. So again, it's a great use of your paperless office module is before you clear out all the checks and the deposits that have cleared through your bank, send those reports to paperless office so that you have them saved as a PDF with everything that got cleared during that bank reconciliation. When you do the period end in any of your modules, as I mentioned before, it resets that current fiscal period and current fiscal year in that parameter option. Well, what that does is it affects your inquiries and your reports, but it also affects anything that's running off of period to date and year to date. So I have up on the screen a picture of the vendor maintenance, and on the summary tab, you'll notice that it shows me the period to date and year to date information for this vendor. What's defaulting in there is based on my current period and my fiscal year. Now the good news is if you're on an updated release, I think probably 2013 and up, this is date sensitive, so if I were to change it on the screen to period 11 or period 10, it would show me the period to date and year to date as of that date. In the old releases of Sage, or if you're running one of the old modules that have not been rewritten into the infrastructure, such as payroll, job cost, or work order, in those modules, these are actually just buckets, and when you run the period end, in again, work order, job cost, or payroll, it just zeroes out this bucket. So in those modules, it's actually a bit more important that you run your period end on a regular basis because it is not date sensitive, and when you come in here, the period to date is just collecting data since the last time you ran the period end. So something to be aware of. If you need additional help with the period end or the year end, Sage has some great online checklists that you can access directly in Sage. So in Sage, if you go to Help Topics and navigate your way to a screen that looks like this, where you can get to the index and type in the word checklists, it'll actually give you a period end checklist for each module. So on the screen here, you can see I've got the accounts receivable checklist, and within there, you can see some blue hyperlinks for finance charge calculation, accounts receivable sales tax report. If you click on those hyperlinks, it'll give you additional information about that topic. So for example, if you want to know more about finance charges, you would click on that hyperlink and it will give you more information about how to process finance charges. So these online checklists are out there for each module, and they'll give you additional information about closing that module. Okay, so some final kind of closing tips. Period end reports. I typically recommend that you do your reconciliations and run all those reports before you actually do the period end function. You may have noticed that when you go to do period end, there's a checkbox that says, do you want to run period end reports? And if you check that, it'll spit out the period end reports that you set up. For example, maybe the AR aging report and the AR trial balance, and you can add to that list. It does that when you're actually closing out the month. So my preference is that you do your reconciliation ahead of time so that when you actually are doing period end, you've most likely already run those reports. I prefer to set up a My Task folder, or if you're on version 2017 or higher, it now is My Tasks is now called Favorites. So either create a folder in Favorites or My Tasks that says Period End Reports, and grab all the reports that you want to run at period end and put them all in one folder. So then when period end time comes, you can just go through the reports one by one and just send them all to Paperless Office and run all your month-end reports that you need at one time. The period end is going to purge history based on those parameter options, so make sure you're aware of how much history you're keeping in each module. Purchase order history. If you're on version 2015 or higher, Sage now retains PO history, and some of you may still have some settings set based on when Sage did not keep PO history, which is there's a setting that says how many days do you want to keep a completed purchase order in your open PO file, and oftentimes that's set to 999 because it used to not keep history. So what that means is when you go and do the magnifying glass and look up purchase orders, it's showing you POs going back potentially 3 years, even though a whole bunch of those purchase orders have already been closed out. So you may want to change that setting for purchase orders if you're on version 2015 or higher, since you now have access to history. So I usually recommend maybe 90 days. And the reason I say 90 days is the only reason to keep purchase orders that are completed in the open file is if you may need to do a return to vendor. Because when you do a return to vendor, if the PO is still in the open file, it'll bring up all the information on the PO, all the line items, and you can just do your return without having to key in part numbers. If the PO is completely in history and is no longer in open, to do a return to vendor, you would actually have to key in each part number that you want to return. So how many days of POs that are completed to keep in that open file is kind of based on how long do you need to make sure you're not going to be returning that item to a vendor. So I say maybe 90 days, but for your company that might be shorter or longer. General ledger is what controls what period can be posted. So I highly recommend that you run the general ledger period close on a timely basis after you've done all your financial statements to prevent anybody from posting into a closed period. So once the general ledger is closed for December 2017 and you've produced your financial statements, that means no one will be able to post into that period. If they do accidentally post into it, now they've just affected your financial statements. The general ledger can be reopened at any time. So if you close it and then someone says, oh, I've got to make an entry into December, you can just reopen it and then you would just reclose it again and then redo your financial statements. So I think it's important that your general ledger is on a current period and that you close out your old modules so that people are not posting into past periods. The other reason for closing your modules every period is that when you run your reports and inquiries, again, it defaults to your current period, and when you're looking at period to date, year to date, either an inquiry or report, that is going to default to your current. Once you've done all of your year-end stuff, again, I would recommend that you do a year-end backup, perhaps one that does not get overwritten, and you may want to store that off-site. So additional year-end resources. So you can contact RKL support if you need assistance. There is the Sage Online Help, and then there's also a Sage City Year-End Center. If you're not currently a member of Sage City, it's free to join, and what it is a website of consultants, Sage 100 users, and also Sage employees that exchange ideas. You can ask questions. It's basically like getting free support. And on the Sage City website, they have a year-end section specifically with everything that you might need to know about year-end. It will have information about those IRDs, about the tax updates. If you're doing payroll, it has information about your tax updates. So the website is listed here on this slide, but it's called Sage City. You need to register, but it is free, and that is a great resource for year-end as well as overall general Sage 100 assistance. So that concludes the year-end webinar. Just a couple more contact persons for your information. If you're on the East Coast, so east of the Mississippi, your customer account manager is Gia Lane. If you're on the West Coast, then your account representative is Mike Scher. And if you need assistance through RKL support, the best way to reach them is usually through email. There is a phone number you can call as well, but to be honest, they tend to be on the phone a lot. If you email them, they can get a support case written up for you right away, and then whoever's available first will be able to go ahead and respond to your request. So we'll now open this up for questions.
Karen, we have one question from Susan Arita. Can you restrict future periods, for example, to prevent from others finishing work for the calendar year or on January 3rd or 4th and not being careful about typing in 12/31/2017 and not accidentally posting to 12/31/2018?
So there's not a way to restrict by closing. However, I know I probably shouldn't open up Sage, but there is a setting in the user setup in the security where you can say that you want to restrict a user, although I think it restricts them to the current period and one future period. But there is a setting in the Sage user setup that you may want to just take a look at. And I think it's the current period plus one future period. But that may help.
Great. All right, this now concludes our webinar.